Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night. And feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. Has there ever been a moment when a step slows, deep within a nameless forest, where no map exists, no trace of any path, only the damp, yielding layer of fallen leaves beneath one's feet, and a coolness in the air that clings to the skin like an unseen mist, making each movement more vivid, more deliberate, as though time itself has begun to drift in a different rhythm. Sound does not vanish, it settles. The faint tremor of insects, a light wind threading through the canopy, leaves brushing one another in a long, unhurried whisper, without urgency, without intent, simply existing. And then a hand meets a surface, cold, unyielding, not smoothed by water or worn by wind, but flat in a way that feels too precise, too silent. Something stirs, faint and uncertain, not fear, only a question not yet fully formed, like a drop of cold water seeping quietly into thought. Perhaps it begins with a small detail, a straight line that has no place in nature, a right angle where everything ought to soften, and then, slowly, the stones emerge as though untouched by time, their surfaces pressed together so closely that no gap remains. No clear mark of primitive tools, no trace of the disorder that usually belongs to formations shaped by chance. Stone structures did appear early in human history, as far back as around 9,500 BCE, when people had already begun raising monumental forms even before many stable agricultural systems had fully taken shape. Yet even those milestones remain within a frame that science can follow, can explain. What lies beneath this hand seems not to belong to that frame. It seems to exist beyond it. If one day a dating were made, and if the result were to reveal that these stones had stood for 10,000, 12,000 years, or perhaps far longer, what would happen if they stood beside, or even before, the oldest structures ever known? History has long told that complex societies arise only after the settling of agriculture, when time, resources, and stability allow for building, for organizing, for imagining beyond a single season. But if something like this existed before all of that, then the chain of reasoning would begin to slip from its place, not shattering at once, but shifting just enough that everything following it no longer fits as it once did. A hand resting on a slab of stone, a moment so small it might pass unnoticed, yet when extended across tens of thousands of years, through layers of sedimented memory and forgetting, through cycles of climate that reshape the face of the planet, it begins to touch something larger, a question that no longer belongs to the forest alone. What if what is called history is only what remains, like fragments rising after a tide has withdrawn? Civilizations may have emerged, then vanished, then been buried beneath the very ground they once walked upon, leaving behind so little trace, so little memory, and almost no complete story. And if all that remains are fragments scattered in this way, then a thought begins to take form, slowly, almost unnoticed, yet impossible to dismiss. What if we are the seventh? If there were cycles before? If there have been other beginnings and endings? Then where are they now? And what erased them from the surface of this world? Not with a clear and final mark, but with a silence stretched across thousands of years. What would it mean if the most familiar idea of history, the one that has quietly stood behind nearly every modern textbook, were only one perspective among many that have existed upon this earth? In Europe during the Enlightenment, especially throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, a powerful vision took shape and spread alongside science, technology, education, and modern institutions. That history is a path ascending, a line stretching from darkness into light, from the simple to the complex, from the primitive to agriculture, from agriculture to cities, from cities to industry, and onward to the present world, where each stage is almost always assumed to surpass the one before it. Within that vision, humanity advances step by step as though climbing an unseen ladder, while the past, however worthy of respect, remains largely regarded as the lower ground beneath the present. Certain thinkers of that age placed immense faith in the progress of human intellect, viewing the expansion of knowledge as the force that draws history forward. It has become the default model many carry without ever realizing it. Yet is time truly an arrow moving in only one direction? On the ancient Indian subcontinent, within a tradition of thought formed early and preserved through great religious and philosophical texts, time does not appear as a line but as a wheel, turning so slowly it seems almost without end. There, 4 ages unfold within a vast cycle, beginning with a near-perfect era, where order remains intact, morality complete, and human life closer to a state of clarity, then gradually descending through successive ages as lifespans shorten, spiritual qualities diminish, and disorder grows, until the final stage, an age of decline. That cycle does not close with an absolute ending, but with a collapse that opens into another beginning. Its scale is not measured in centuries or millennia, but in millions of years, as though the ancient imagination did not see humanity within the brief breath of empires, but within a deeper pulse of the cosmos, a culture that saw time as a loop that endures, a loop where the golden age lies far behind, not ahead. Moving westward toward the ancient Mediterranean, the same pattern emerges in another voice. Around the 8th century BCE, in Greece, within the early world of poetry and myth seeking to grasp the nature of humankind, Hesiod described the ages of humanity as metals darkening over time. It begins with the Golden Age, then silver, bronze, the Age of Heroes, and finally iron, the age he believed himself to inhabit. This structure does not mirror the Indian model exactly, yet its spiritual rhythm invites a pause. It begins in abundance and peace, and closes in hardship, conflict, and moral decay. The present age, in this vision, is not the peak, but the heaviest point of the cycle, not an ascent, but a descent, not endless progress, but the memory of something better that has been lost, another culture, distant in geography, different in language, different in gods, remembers time along almost the same curve. In Mesoamerica, from the first millennium BCE until the period before European arrival, another layer of cosmology unfolds, where the world does not simply age, but is destroyed and remade again and again. Within the traditions of those civilizations, especially in Aztec thought and the cyclical visions of the Maya, the present world is not the first. It follows other worlds, other suns, other creations. Each age comes into being, endures for a time, then disappears beneath some form of catastrophe, wind, fire, flood, as though nature is not merely the stage of history, but also its erasure. The idea that humanity lives under the fifth sun does more than evoke antiquity. It reveals a clear structure, that before this present there were other presents, before this world there were other worlds. Once more, the familiar pattern returns: creation, existence, decline, destruction, and renewal. In a place far removed from Greece and India by oceans, the memory remains. It has only taken on another name. To the north of Europe, a similar rhythm persists, though told through ice, flame, and the fate of gods. In the Norse tradition recorded around the 13th century, drawn from much older oral layers, Ragnarok appears as the great ending of the existing order, when Odin, Thor, Loki and many other forces are drawn into a final conflict, where the world does not die in silence, but in violent collision between gods, monsters, fire and ice. Yet what matters most lies not in the destruction, but in what follows. The world is not only destroyed, it returns. Some gods survive, some humans endure. A new order rises upon a cleansed earth. It is not an end in the sense of finality. It is an end as a hinge, a door closing so that another turning may begin. Destruction, then renewal, collapse, then restoration. The motif repeats, echoing across distant latitudes of human memory. Ancient Egypt offers a more subtle expression of the same intuition. From around 3000 BCE onward, within the worldview of the Nile Valley, the focus is not on a single final catastrophe, but on a continuous tension between order and chaos, between what is upheld and what constantly threatens to dissolve it. There, cosmic order is not fixed once and forever, but must be continually restored. The king bears the task of maintaining that balance, as though each dawn were a fragile victory overnight. The cycle here is softer, less apocalyptic, yet no less profound. The world tilts, is drawn back, then tilts again. Not all cultures speak of fire from the heavens or of great floods. Some speak of perpetual rebalancing, where collapse is not always total annihilation, but the moment when order must be called back. The form changes, yet the principle of repetition remains. When these models are placed side by side, a shared shape begins to emerge, slowly, like an image rising beneath water. First, a golden age, when the world stands closer to harmony, then decline, often felt through moral decay, shortened lives, and a growing distance from an original order, then chaos, then catastrophe, whether by divine will, natural forces, or internal decay. And finally, renewal, either as a new world or as order rebuilt from ruin. What invites reflection is not only the structure itself, but the fact that it appears in cultures with no direct contact, separated by oceans, deserts, and thousands of years. Why do they remember the same arc of meaning? Why do so many traditions place the Golden Age behind, not ahead? Why do so many stories begin in order, pass through decline, reach catastrophe, and open into renewal? Perhaps here, myth begins to change its meaning. It is no longer merely a beautiful story imagined to explain the sky, the fire, the waters, or fate. It may be a form of memory, compressed, a memory that has lost its exact dates, its precise maps, its original names, yet has retained the shape of a fall and the rhythm of return. That memory may have passed through countless generations, wrapped in symbols, stretched into gods and monsters, transformed into lost golden ages, vanished suns, and final battles of the cosmos. Yet beneath those layers, what remains may be something very old, very enduring, deeply human. That civilizations are not only born, they can vanish. That order is not only built, it can be erased. That history may not be merely a march of progress, but a turning of cycles, of formation, flourishing, dissolution, and rebirth under another name. It is at this point that cycle theory ceases to be a marginal curiosity and becomes a framework worth holding in mind when stepping deeper into the mysteries that follow. For if so many cultures have told the same structure again and again, then the question is no longer only what they imagined, but what they remember. Could those stories be more than symbols? Could they be fragments of a memory older than recorded history? Could there still be, beneath myth, a hard core of shared experience, something that has survived empires, languages, and the many times the world has changed its face? Once that possibility is allowed, even faintly, every site, every legend, every ambiguous ruin that appears thereafter no longer remains mere story. They begin to resemble scattered memories, and if those memories truly point towards some ancient civilization that once existed, then sank beneath time as stone sinks beneath deep waters, the next question becomes almost unavoidable. How might it be recognized, when most of what belonged to it has long since been erased by the earth itself? The most difficult part in any contemplation of lost cycles of civilization does not lie in imagining who they were, where they lived, or what they built. It lies in a question far colder, far slower, closer to physics than to legend if an industrial civilization had truly arisen deep in Earth's past. Perhaps hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years ago. What, if anything, will this planet still retain of them today? The question sounds simple, but follow it just a little further, and it shifts the entire perspective. The focus is no longer on radiant cities buried beneath sand, no longer on stone towers sleeping beneath forests, but on the way oceans, sediments, plate tectonics, erosion, and the carbon cycle move together like a vast machine, so slow as to be nearly invisible, yet powerful enough to grind away almost every trace a civilization might once have believed permanent. Within this frame, what emerges is not a bold claim that another industrial world preceded ours, but a problem of recognition. If it did happen, how would the geological record speak of it? Or more precisely, what fragment would remain after most forms have been worn beyond recognition by time? Seen this way, the central figure is no longer a vanished empire, but the Earth itself, a planet that does not keep memory in the way humans expect. Its surface is not a still museum, but a skin forever shedding, rewritten, erased, and overwritten again. The ocean floor does not remain in place indefinitely, for sections of oceanic crust drift towards subduction zones and disappear into the deep. The continents are scarcely more faithful. Wind, water, ice, chemical reactions, sedimentation, and deformations stretched across spans far exceeding human lifetimes all take part, quietly, in the work of erasure, a structure may convince a generation that it will endure forever. Yet on geological time, that belief is thinner than dust. A city once ablaze with life may, given enough time, first lose its form, then its materials, and finally even the possibility of recognition. A quiet paradox takes shape. What is most monumental within the lifespan of a civilization is not necessarily what remains clear within the lifespan of the planet. Concrete cracks, metals oxidize, artificial structures fracture, collapse, are buried, redistributed, worn down into fragments too small to tell the story of their original form. Coastal regions, where civilizations often flourish through trade and water, are also the most fragile before shifting sea levels, storms, sedimentation, and the slow migration of shorelines across millennia. Even the seemingly stable surfaces of continents are not spared. Time does not strike in a single blow. It works like cold water seeping into stone, like roots threading through fractures, like a silent hand. Cities may vanish not in catastrophe, but in dissolution so prolonged that walls, streets, foundations, harbours all become nothing more than displaced matter. Even plastic, that emblem of the industrial age, may not endure as intact objects. Without exceptional burial conditions, it fragments, degrades, dissolves into secondary signals far more difficult to read than the popular imagination of preserved relics would suggest. On the human scale, cities appear durable. On the scale of rock, of ocean, of the slow-moving crust beneath our feet, they may be startlingly fragile. From that fragility, another way of seeing emerges. If physical form is so easily lost, then what remains may not be walls, plazas, or lines upon a map, but subtle deviations within the planet's own chemistry. An industrial civilization does more than build or smelt metal. It alters the atmosphere, carbon, materials, sediments, processes far larger than itself. The more enduring trace may not take the shape of architecture, but of a signature, a sudden disturbance in the carbon cycle, an unusual isotopic shift, a sediment layer containing synthetic compounds foreign to the familiar natural background, a signal small, cold, faint, yet measurable. Marine sediment cores, lakes, coastal basins thus become more revealing than legends of sunken cities, for they do not preserve the face of the past, but its chemical breath. A modern example makes this clearer. Marine sediment layers have already begun to record a sharp rise in microplastics between roughly 1945 and 2009. Only a few decades of industrial activity have produced a stratigraphic signal that can be measured, suggesting that what civilizations leave behind may not appear as monuments, but as fine dust resting in mud, as tiny particles settling into the deep as a wordless reminder. What is striking is this: if such a signal were discovered millions of years from now, it might not immediately be recognized as evidence of civilization. It might be labeled an anomaly, noted as an unexplained disturbance within Earth's systems. And that is precisely the point. Material memory does not always tell its story directly. Cities may vanish, a shift in carbon may remain, architecture may dissolve, an isotopic anomaly may persist like ink seeped into stone. Plastic may not survive as objects, yet what it does to sediment may outlast its own form. From here, a quiet reversal reveals itself. The mistake may not lie in a lack of imagination. but in expecting the past to survive in forms familiar to our eyes. The absence of an ancient industrial city does not prove impossibility, for the geological record makes no promise to preserve everything intact for distant futures. Preservation, on the scale of a planet, is the exception, not the rule. It is more reasonable not to hunt for a complete civilization as one hunts for a perfectly preserved image, but to learn to recognize incomplete signatures, anomalies in chemistry, in materials, in atmospheric rhythms, in strata that do not entirely match their natural surroundings. This does not open the door to limitless speculation. On the contrary, it demands stricter discipline, colder patience. Instead of asking where the complete evidence lies, one must ask where an anomaly is compelling enough to pause upon, compelling enough to ask one more question. Thus, the climax of understanding does not come from a staggering discovery, but from something almost humble. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A civilization, if it existed, may no longer stand as structure, yet still leave behind small, cold, unreadable oscillations in rock, sediment, global chemistry. A memory may lose its face, yet retain a faint heartbeat beneath mute matter, and once that door opens, the way we look at every myth begins to change. A sunken continent, an unusual stone, an ancient tale of a world before catastrophe will no longer be asked only whether it is complete proof. A more careful, deeper question emerges: is there within it a deviation worth keeping in sight? A gap real enough to compel science to lean closer once more? There, the boundary between myth and physics is no longer a wall, but a narrow extended bridge, spanning the silence of time. Some ideas are not born from dreams, but from a very real gap in human understanding, from a small question set upon a desk in the 19th century, slowly expanding until it takes on the shadow of a lost world. Lemuria is one such idea. It did not begin with temples beneath the sea, nor with giant ancestors, nor with a forgotten mother civilization submerged in dark waters. It began in the academic air of England, in the aftermath of Darwin, when evolution had shaken humanity's view of life, and when biogeography, the distribution of living species across Earth, had become a puzzle at once new and deeply unsettling. For if life evolves along long pathways, if plants and animals do not arise at random but are tied to histories of land, climate and isolation, then why does their distribution appear fractured in such strange ways? Why does a group of species appear clearly in one place, vanish across intervening regions, and then faintly reappear in some distant land? In the 19th century, this was no idle speculation. It was a serious scientific problem, examined among sketches, specimens, voyages, and records from Madagascar, from India, from islands and coastlines of the Indian Ocean, where nature seemed to conceal a map not yet fully read. In that setting, Madagascar stood out as something almost defiant. There, lemurs existed in remarkable abundance. They were bound to the island, yet suggested connection stretching outward, toward India, toward a history of distribution not easily explained by the boundaries drawn upon contemporary maps. What had once connected those lands? What had allowed life to spread, then fragment? In an age before plate tectonics, before the great drifting of continents was understood, the distances between land masses still carried the mystery of an unopened book. Land bridges, sunken expanses, vanished continents. These were not the language of fantasy, but of science, provisional ways of connecting scattered points, like placing a plank across a fissure to continue walking. Within this atmosphere, Philip Lutley Sclater emerged as the figure who set the story in motion. An English zoologist, living from 1829 to 1913, he worked in a world where classification and comparison of species were becoming vast intellectual endeavours. The year 1864 marked a turning point, not with the city sinking beneath the sea, but with a name given to fill a gap in knowledge. Observing the distribution of lemurs, Sclater saw Madagascar as a crucial link. To explain its connection with India, he proposed that a large land mass, perhaps a continent in the Indian Ocean, had once existed and later vanished. He called this hypothesis Lemuria. Its importance lies in its simplicity. In Sclater's hands, Lemuria was not a mystical empire. It carried no ancient armies, no secret orders, no superhuman races emerging from prehistoric mist. It was a theoretical tool, a conceptual bridge built to solve a problem in biogeography. By 19th century standards, it was entirely reasonable. When biological distribution raised confusion, but geology had yet to provide a unifying model for continental separation. A lost continent did not sound absurd, but orderly, a temporary answer shaped to fill a blank in the map of life. Perhaps Lemuria's first appeal was not that it was true, but that it once made sense. This is worth pausing over. Without it, one might assume all lost continents are merely products of imagination. In truth, for many decades in the late 19th century, before continental drift gained acceptance, before plate tectonics became the foundation of modern geology, land bridge hypotheses were commonly used to explain discontinuities in flora and fauna. A species appearing in two distant regions yet absent between them, a plant family spanning impossible distances, these demanded explanation. In that context, a sunken landmass was not mythic whisper, but a provisional connection between mismatched evidence. Science, in every era, works with the tools it has. Without the vision of continents drifting over millions of years like massive rafts upon the mantle, people were bound to think in terms closest at hand: invisible land bridges, lost continents, gateways that once opened and closed beneath the sea. These ideas may be wrong by today's understanding, yet in their time they were not unreasonable. They were serious attempts to turn disorder into coherence, proof that science advances not only through correct answers, but through provisional models that lead thought forward. Then the larger picture of geology emerged, the idea of continental drift, and later plate tectonics, provided a deeper, more consistent explanation for many puzzles of biological distribution. The distances between Madagascar, India, and other regions no longer required a vanished Lemuria. Modern science gradually closed the geological chapter of that hypothesis, not through dramatic rejection, but through the steady accumulation of evidence, like a rising tide that quietly erases an old shoreline. Yet an idea, once named, rarely dies within the confines of the study. It may leave the desk of the naturalist and drift into other spaces, where human needs are not only to explain nature, but to seek a story of origins. There, Lemuria began to change its meaning. In the late 19th century and beyond, within the English-speaking world, amid the rise of Western esotericism, it moved beyond natural science into a far more fluid and elusive realm. Theosophy emerged as a powerful intellectual current, blending religion, mysticism, ancient symbolism, aspirations toward hidden knowledge, and the desire to place human history upon a stage larger than empirical history could then provide. Within this space, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky became a central figure. She took Lemuria and wove it into the concept of root races, transforming a name once used to explain lemur distribution into the ancient homeland of early human stages within a vast esoteric narrative. That moment marks the true climax of this story, not through earthquakes or rising seas, but through a complete transformation of meaning. The name remained, but the world behind it changed entirely. Lemuria no longer served biogeography. It was no longer a bridge between Madagascar and India. It became a vast continent, a half-sacred, half-obscured realm, a place upon which visions of human origin, lost cycles, and a mother civilization beyond recorded history could be projected. From lemurs to humankind, from species distribution to ancestral myth, from a bounded scientific hypothesis to an almost limitless symbol, the shift unfolded like a dream rewritten upon the margin of an old academic note. Perhaps this is how many lost civilizations are born in the collective imagination, not from absolute emptiness, but from a real gap in knowledge, a region where science of a given age has yet to shine its light, into which mysticism, symbolism, storytelling, and a longing for origins gradually flow, filling the void with images larger, more beautiful, more uncertain. Lemuria thus becomes a foundation for the entire journey. It shows that between science and myth there is not always a rigid wall, but a twilight zone where a concept may change form while keeping its name, like a river flowing through many lands, reflecting different skies. Modern science has all but closed the geological case of Lemuria. The continent once imagined to connect Madagascar and India does not stand under present geological understanding. Yet the question of why memories of sunken lands, vanished coastal societies, and worlds consumed by water continue to return across cultures does not disappear. Perhaps the name Lemuria is wrong. Perhaps its form never existed. Perhaps the entire continent was only a shadow cast by the limits of an era. But what if beneath that mistaken shadow lies a truer core, not of a mystical continent in the Indian Ocean, but of real coastal lands that did sink, real communities that vanished, real memories carried away by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, leaving behind in human consciousness only a faint sense that there was once another world closer to the water, closer to the horizon, closer to the beginning than we now imagine. From the closing years of the 19th century, especially from the 1880s onward, Lemuria began to change shape within the imagination of the English-speaking world, as though a landmass once proposed merely to explain a gap in biological distribution had slowly slipped from the scientist's desk and fallen into a dimmer, wider, deeper realm, where maps no longer served only to connect distant shores, but to bridge the dreams of human origins. At first, the name belonged to a biogeographical hypothesis, an attempt of the 19th century to account for the distribution of species between Madagascar and India. Yet as it entered the growing currents of mysticism of that same era, particularly within the intellectual world surrounding theosophy, Lemuria ceased to be a hypothetical strip of land. It expanded. It gathered new layers of meaning. It became an ancient homeland, a prehistoric stage, a place where sacred history, human lineage, and primordial knowledge lay upon one another like veils of mist. Within that transformation, Helena Blavatsky stands as a figure nearly inseparable from the shift. Born in 1831 and passing in 1891, she was among those who carried Lemuria entirely beyond its scientific origins into another order of thought, where the question was no longer how species travelled between distant lands, but where humanity began, through which root races it had passed, and what memories had been lost in the deep and shadowed cycles of time. The name remained the same, yet its subject had changed. The echo endured, yet its spirit was no longer what it had been. In this new telling, Lemuria was no longer a land bridge joining Madagascar to the Indian Ocean. It became a vast ancient continent, a mother civilization, a mysterious cradle of humankind. What matters here is not whether the story is true or false, but how far a scientific name may be drawn when it touches an ancient human need. The need to believe that behind visible history lies another, deeper, older one. Buried beneath water, beneath sand, beneath the dimming memory of the self. Yet the more it swelled within mysticism, the more Lemuria was forced to face a colder, slower, unavoidable question. If such a continent had truly existed, would modern geology still find it? That question carried the entire narrative into the 20th century, into a time when science possessed a far stronger framework for explaining the separation of continents, the drifting of land masses, and the birth and dissolution of supercontinents across Earth's vast history. As continental drift gained acceptance, and later as plate tectonics became the foundation of modern geology, the gaps that once made lost continent theories seem plausible began to close. The ocean floor was studied in greater detail. The structure of the crust became clearer. The movement of tectonic plates revealed that Earth required no recently sunken Lemuria to explain biological distribution or geographic separation. An old framework, once useful within the limited knowledge of the 19th century, began to fade like a shadow that had lost its purpose. In the light of modern science, another fact emerged, quiet yet significant. Since the end of the last ice age, over roughly 20,000 years, global sea levels have risen by about 120 meters. It is a vast measure, vast enough to drown ancient shorelines, continental shelves, river mouths, lagoons, islands, and coastal plains, places that were often rich in resources and drew human settlement. Yet 120 meters, however great, does not mean that a mythical supercontinent vanished whole within the recent memory of humankind. Here, science nearly closes the case of Lemuria in its classical geological sense. There is no immense, mysterious continent that once lay across the Indian Ocean and sank as earlier imaginations had conceived. That door, in the literal sense, is almost entirely shut. And yet, when one door closes, another may only just begin to open. The question need no longer be whether Lemuria existed, for under the light of modern geology, the answer to its most rigid form is nearly settled. What remains worth holding lies elsewhere, softer, less graspable, perhaps more enduring. If the name Lemuria is mistaken, might the feeling beneath it still touch upon some real loss? If not a supercontinent, then perhaps coastal worlds. If not a mother civilization spanning the ocean, then perhaps many small communities, island societies, shore-bound cultures, river mouths that once existed at the end of the Ice Age, only to be severed, fragmented, and erased from the map by rising waters. When the question turns in this way, the entire field of vision changes. From the Indian Ocean of the original hypothesis, it opens toward the Pacific, toward archipelagos, coastlines, submerged continental shelves, toward 12,000 years ago when the Holocene began. And the post-glacial world did not emerge in a single instant, but through a long, slow, unceasing chain of transformations. Rising seas stand as the greatest physical force within this story. They require no myth to become fearsome. They require only time, a few centuries, then a few millennia, a shoreline slowly retreating, an island growing smaller, a fertile river mouth turning into unfamiliar water. Memory begins to fracture. Homeland drifts away. Communities without names, without inscriptions, without records in the familiar sense, may be pushed into a darkness that modern archaeology has only begun to touch in fragments. In that light, Lemuria takes on yet another role. No longer a continent to be found upon a map, no longer a mother civilization to be revered in mysticism. It becomes a shell of a name, a vessel cracked, yet perhaps still echoing with what it once contained. Traditions of sunken lands, of vanished islands, of homelands taken by the sea, need not be read as evidence of a supercontinent. They may be read as cultural memories magnified from real geographic losses, not memory precise as a map, not memory measured in coordinates, but memory like a seed buried in dark soil, altered, distorted, yet not entirely dead. Here, the layer of cultural memory becomes striking. Many oral traditions along coastlines and across the Pacific have long spoken of lands swallowed by water, of islands torn apart, of shores no longer as they once were. No single story compels the conclusion that Lemuria existed. No single legend can replace geology. Yet as modern research into oral traditions and sea level rise suggests that collective memory may preserve traces of ancient shoreline changes far longer than once believed, a quiet possibility emerges. Perhaps myth does not preserve events with precision, but preserves the feeling of events. Perhaps what remains is not the shape of a continent, but the memory of a horizon that receded. Perhaps what passes through generations is not the true name of a land, but the shock of its disappearance. Thus Lemuria may be wrong in position, wrong in form, wrong in scale, but is it wholly wrong, or beneath its errors, does there remain a smaller, truer, more human core, the faint memory of coastal worlds that once existed and were cut away by rising seas? The question does not redeem mysticism. It does not restore a lost continent. It performs a quieter task, yet perhaps a more enduring one. It keeps the door from closing entirely. For if Lemuria must be read in that way, as a mistaken name but not an entirely mistaken longing, then the gaze must now turn downward, beneath the water, toward a colder, sharper, more tangible place, where the debate is no longer only of myth or memory, but of stone, of cross-sections, of steps, of angles, of forms poised between nature and ruin. Strange enough that the old question does not vanish, but merely changes shape. In 1986, off the coast of Yonaguni Island at the westernmost edge of Japan, where the Ryukyu archipelago opens into the western Pacific and brushes the waters near the Philippines, a discovery began in a manner disarmingly ordinary, almost entirely modern, bearing little trace of ancient myth. Kihachiro Aratake, a diver and tour operator in the region, while searching for hammerhead sharks in the strong currents surrounding the island, came upon beneath the sea a formation so unusual that it resisted being seen as mere rock. There was not only stone, there were broad flat surfaces, sharp edges, descending steps as though some hand had once sought to press the disorder of nature into a clearer order. That is what made the moment singular. A site on land may be approached by foot, through layers of soil, through scattered traces of habitation, but at Yonaguni, everything lies beneath water, within an unquiet sea, within a space that reveals itself only to those who descend below the waves, where light bends and forms emerge in silence as though they have slept there for a very long time. What Arataki saw was not an amorphous mass. It appeared as a series of connected surfaces, layered tiers, boundaries so sharp that the mind almost instinctively reached for a familiar association: architecture, construction, the trace of intention. From that moment, Yonaguni entered a rare grey territory within debates about the past. It is no longer merely rock beneath the sea, yet it has never been fully accepted by the scholarly world as a man-made ruin. It hangs suspended between two readings, like a shape that invites a different name each time it is seen. Perhaps that is why the debate surrounding Yonaguni does not arise from the stories told about it, but from its very form, from the way a submerged mass of stone can evoke something so close to the idea of a constructed work. From the late 20th century to the present, the most haunting aspect of Yonaguni has been its appearance. The main structure lies at a depth of several tens of meters, often described as a terraced formation. Some compare it to a ziggurat, others call it a submerged pyramid, others simply pause before its unnervingly clean plains and sense an unsettling order. There are steps like vast stairways, broad flat surfaces like platforms or courtyards, long straight edges, near right angles, blocks joined in repeating patterns that awaken architectural intuition almost at once. Here, the human eye becomes part of the story. The eye is accustomed to recognizing order, to seeing intention in straight lines, to reading geometry as the mark of human hands. A jagged cliff does not disturb memory. A long flat surface intersecting another at a right angle provokes an almost instinctive question. Why is it so clean? Why does it appear shaped? Why, within a submerged reef, does something resemble the remnant of a foundation? One of the most prominent academic voices for this interpretation is Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist who has studied Yonaguni for many years, building models, examining its structure, and concluding that at least part of it may bear signs of human modification. In this view, Yonaguni is not merely strange, it is familiar, like a structure stripped of its context, like something that once belonged to land before belonging to water, like a memory submerged, leaving geometry as the final skin of the past. At times, it has even been linked to the idea of a Japanese Atlantis, a comparison that invites controversy, yet reveals the peculiar hold this place has upon modern imagination. Yet in geology, form has never been the final word. Rock does not only break, it also organizes its appearance according to laws strong enough to deceive intuition. Yonaguni thus becomes not only a hypothetical archaeological mystery, but a rigorous test of the ability to distinguish between what is made and what merely appears to be made. The natural explanation has been reinforced over years of debate by a precise logic. The region consists of sandstone layers with clear bedding planes, easily separated along those layers and intersected by vertical joints. When such formations exist within a tectonically active environment, subject to faulting, earthquakes, and prolonged weathering and erosion, they can fracture along remarkably straight lines, forming steps, angles, and flat surfaces of startling regularity. Robert M. Schoch stands among the notable proponents of this view. From this perspective, Yonaguni is not a submerged construction. It is geology wearing a language that humans are accustomed to assigning to architecture. This interpretation gains further weight through recent geomorphological analyses that move beyond mere visual impression. Studies of digital terrain, stratigraphy, and microgeomorphology across geosites on the island indicate that Yonaguni's surfaces are strongly shaped by bedding, linear joints, weathering, and erosion acting upon sandstone according to consistent rules capable of producing forms strikingly similar to architecture. In this reading, the steps are no longer stairways, but expressions of stratification. The straight lines are not walls, but traces of fractures. The flat surfaces are not courtyards, but the result of rock being cut, separated, and slowly worn by water and time, patient and indifferent, requiring no human hand. And yet the debate refuses to settle entirely, in part because geology can explain much, but may not erase the unease Yonaguni provokes when seen, in part because the same formation is read through two different languages. Archaeology sees the possibility of intentional form. Geology sees the logic of material and process. One asks whether this might be a ruin. The other asks why ruins need be invoked when stone alone can produce all of this. From the geological standpoint, Yonaguni stands as a classic example of nature's power, of the capacity of rock layers, fractures, faults, and erosion to create geometry so compelling that architectural intuition is drawn in. From a perspective closer to chimeras, the question is not a single step or a single right angle, but the dense concentration of too many features that appear too regular, too precise, too arranged within a relatively confined space. Nature may achieve part of it, perhaps much of it, but has it done all of it? The question remains, quiet as the sea washing over stone, unanswered, unwilling to disappear. It is perhaps here that Yonaguni gains its significance within the broader journey of thought. It need not be a sunken city to haunt the mind. It need only stand at the boundary between two possibilities, between nature and civilization, between geology and archaeology, between fractured sandstone shaped by time and some lingering memory of ancient shores that we no longer know how to fully read. If, even in the slightest measure, any part of Yonaguni bears the mark of human hands, then the story shifts from form into time. For if it holds any human element, however small, it must belong to a period when that region lay above or nearer the surface than it does today. Then the question is no longer stone or structure. It becomes one of age, of ancient shorelines, of what prehistoric coastal communities were capable of before sea levels rose by roughly 120 meters over the past 20,000 years. Even a small possibility opens a vast consequence. Not the certainty of a lost civilization at Yonaguni, but a demand to reconsider vanished coastlines, places once land that receded beneath the sea, carrying with them the most fragile traces of human presence. Yonaguni offers no final answer. It offers an image, a powerful, restless image, fitting for the borderlands of human memory. There are things that lie between stone and ruin, between natural geometry and the idea of construction, between what can be explained and what still draws the mind to look again. From a submerged formation at the western edge of Japan, the question drifts onward, farther still, toward a myth where the sunken city no longer appears through sandstone terraces and underwater steps, but through a fuller story, one of empire, of pride, of war, of punishment, of a single day and night in which an entire world was swallowed. Atlantis. Atlantis entered the imagination of the Western world not through some excavation beneath the sea, nor from an ancient map uncovered in drifting sands, but from the realm of ancient Greek thought, where great stories seldom stood alone as records of geography, but were set within dialogues about the order of the cosmos, about the nature of human virtue, about the way a society is built and then loses itself. Around the 4th century BCE, in two dialogues often dated to about 360 BCE, that name appears as something distant, an echo driven so far back into the past that it stands almost outside ordinary history. Plato gave the story its frame, yet he did not tell it as a man who had discovered a sunken land. He told it as a philosopher placing before you a complete model of order, power, character, and collapse. The antiquity of Atlantis is deepened by the very path the story takes. It does not pass directly from Plato onto the page. It is carried through Solon, then further back to the Egyptian priests, who in the telling are keepers of memories older than any Greek city. There is something subtle in that chain. It gives Atlantis the air of a memory handed down across generations, as though a fragment of time had endured long enough to reach the present. Yet, at the same time, that very transmission reveals this is not merely memory. It is a story placed exactly where it must stand, within a carefully ordered philosophical and moral frame. Perhaps that is why Atlantis has endured so long in the Western mind, because it resembles history and allegory at once, distant enough to become mysterious, clear enough to serve as a warning. From such a remote source, what emerges is not merely a lost island, but the image of a nearly complete empire. In that telling, Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, often understood as lying past the Strait of Gibraltar, facing the Atlantic at the edge of the known world and at the edge of ancient geographic imagination. That position alone renders it a land beyond the threshold, a place that might exist and yet remain forever unreachable. But what sets Atlantis apart is not only where it lies. What sustains it in collective memory is the way it is described at its height, as a society with form, with structure, with design, with ritual, with law, possessing both symbolic beauty and material strength. At its centre rise concentric rings of land and water, an image both geometric and ceremonial, as though the order of the city reflected a deeper order of the world. Within the mythic current, Poseidon stands at the island's origin, laying the foundation of its first order. Cleito marks the beginning of its royal line, where power and blood converge into a sacred origin. From there, Atlantis ceases to be a place and becomes something like a collective being. Growing layer upon layer, it has its planned city, its harbours and canals, its bridges binding rings of land and water, its armies, its fleets, its precious metals, its hot and cold springs, its rituals and laws, the prosperity of a civilization that does not merely survive but knows how to shape itself into a beautiful order. It is here that Atlantis becomes dangerous to the imagination, for it is not told as a vague tribe lost in mythic mist. It is told as a true civilization, a maritime power, wealthy, formidable, capable of extending its reach across many lands. One can almost see it, the waterways, the harbours, the corridors of power. A society moving with such smoothness that it seems born to endure forever. And yet, at the very point of such perfection, a quiet question begins to form. What becomes of orders so beautiful they seem unbreakable? What fractures first, the walls or the souls within them? In this current of thought, Atlantis is not merely a mythical island. It is a moral and political model where destruction begins not from the sea, but from within. As the story deepens, Atlantis no longer holds its noble form. A silent descent begins. The noble turns to ambition. Harmony tilts toward material excess. Stability slips into expansion. Power once bounded begins to seek escape from its own limits. This is where the lasting pull of Atlantis resides. It does not merely sink, it falls before it sinks. It is not erased only by disaster. It prepares the ground for disaster through its own transformation. Opposed to Atlantis stands the image of primordial Athens, not richer, not more splendid, yet preserving an older quality, an older discipline, a measure of restraint that Atlantis has lost. From here, the story ceases to be a still image of a magnificent island in the sea. It becomes one of the most complete cycles ever imagined for a civilization. A noble beginning, growth within order, ascent to greatness, then decay at the very heart of its splendor. Perhaps that is why Atlantis is never merely the story of a sunken city. It is the story of how a civilization, standing nearest its highest peak, may also stand nearest its deepest fall. When an empire no longer knows how to stop, conflict with the outer world becomes almost inevitable. Atlantis expands its power, reaches beyond its bounds, confronts the early Athens, and here the still beauty of myth shifts into moral and political struggle. On one side stands the force of wealth, design, fleets, and ambition. On the other, an older virtue, restraint, an order not yet eroded from within. The story abandons the ordinary rhythm of history, where empires rise and fall across generations. It rushes toward a mythic ending, where war, earthquake, flood, and the judgment of divine order converge like closing waves. And then it all happens within a single day and night. One day and night. The span is almost absurd against the scale of an empire, and for that very reason, it haunts. A city built for eternity vanishes almost at once. A power thought unshakable is crushed by trembling earth and rising waters. The seas beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in ancient accounts, become difficult to traverse, choked with mud and shoals, as though geography itself retained a dim memory of what was lost. Perfection turns to silt, strength turns to emptiness. The ordered rings of land and water collapse into their opposite, a spiral drawing all into oblivion. Here Atlantis completes its cycle, from an ideal order to a drowned memory, from a perfect city to a persistent warning. What remains is not walls or harbours, but an idea that lingers, that some civilizations do not fall in weakness, but in the moment nearest their height, when their beauty still holds, when their power still spreads, when belief in their permanence is strongest. Perhaps that is why Atlantis returns again and again, like a mirror submerged beneath water, reflecting not only an imagined past, but the unease of the present. From this point, Atlantis is no longer only a tale of virtue and pride. It begins to touch another question, deeper, colder, closer to stone and melting ice. Whether that distant span of time, by chance or design, brushes against the end of the Ice Age, and whether the memory of a sunken empire clings to the faint trace of a far greater physical upheaval than the myth itself recounts. Atlantis is often held in memory as a name too familiar to astonish. A mythical island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a sea power risen to its peak and lost within a single day and night of earthquake and flood. Yet what keeps the story from ever truly resting may not lie only in the image of a sunken city, but in the strange number Plato placed at its centre, some 9,000 years before Solon, a span so deep that, when set against the scale of natural history, it no longer stands fully within the light of philosophy or myth, but begins to slip toward the end of the Pleistocene, toward the edge of a world leaving ice yet not entering stability. There, Atlantis ceases to be only a story of morality, power, and punishment, and becomes a more troubling question: whether there existed a time in Earth's history violent enough that coastal landscapes, low plains, lands that once sustained human communities, could be erased so swiftly that memory remains only as legend. Once that question opens, the centre shifts. Plato remains the starting point, but no longer the centre. The centre becomes climate, ice, rising seas, shorelines once drawn elsewhere than where we see them now. The Atlantic is no longer merely the stage for a philosophical symbol, the Mediterranean no longer merely the cradle of classical civilization. The entire coastal world at the end of the Ice Age appears as a fading map, its lines slowly washed away. Atlantis may never have existed as a literal empire. The whole account may be an architecture of thought, yet its persistence may lie in that number of 9,000 years touching a layer of time when the Earth was indeed unstable, indeed transforming, leaving absences greater than imagination is accustomed to accept. The name that almost must follow is younger Dryas, for if one seeks a moment when the planets seem to step out of ice only to turn back, few periods evoke it so strongly. From about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, as warming at the end of the Pleistocene appeared to open a gentler world, cold returned, not as a fading echo, but as a force pulling the door closed again. Across much of the Northern Hemisphere, especially in Europe and North America, conditions reverted toward near glacial severity. Vegetation shifted, ecosystems moved, fragile balances grew more fragile still. The significance lies not in proving Atlantis, for it does not, but in breaking the familiar sense that deep time is a quiet backdrop where change moves slowly across millennia. Reality seems more intricate. A warming world may suddenly cool. A planet nearing stability may return to disorder. a landscape opening may tighten again. Debates continue over causes. Fresh water surges into the North Atlantic, shifts in ocean circulation, even catastrophic triggers. Yet what matters most is simpler, that the end of the Ice Age was no straight path. It was a broken passage where cold and warmth struggled, where resources shifted, where familiar lands became unfamiliar. In such a setting, one need only imagine communities living along coasts, estuaries, shallow waters rich in life, to sense the silent but relentless pressure upon them. No empire is required for tragedy, only a shoreline, only a people whose lives rest upon the fragile boundary between land and sea. Yet climate is only half the picture. The other half lies in the slow and relentless movement of the ocean. Over the past 20,000 years, since the last glacial maximum, global sea levels have risen by about 120 meters. It sounds like a number, yet as a force rewriting maps, it is nearly a planetary erasure. Coastal plains vanish, estuaries transform. Low lands once binding people to the sea are cut away. Continental shelves that were once dry land sink beneath the water, so quietly that the modern world forgets they were once places to walk, to live, to fish, to build a way of life. The rising sea does not move with the steadiness of a clock. At times it advances more sharply, as though not only overtaking land but entering memory itself. If early communities settled along coasts, what was taken from them was not merely a strip of land, but the entire logic of their existence. Harbours vanish, routes are severed, lagoons become deep bays, fields are salinated or submerged, navigational markers, fish migrations, seasonal waters, the small knowledge gathered across generations, all lose their ground. Such a community does not merely retreat inland, it fragments, it loses its centre, it loses its map. Some losses leave no stone ruins to be uncovered. Some leave only the sense that somewhere there once was a place, vital, abundant, whole, and now it is gone. Under that light, Atlantis begins to sound different, not less mythical, but less wholly detached from the physics of the earth. Descriptions of flood, of earthquake, of sudden collapse, of seas made impassable, of mud and confusion, taken alone, may be symbolic language, yet placed beside a world of melting ice, shifting climate, rising waters, erasing coasts, they gain another resonance, not because every detail aligns with a specific geological event, but because the structure of memory begins to appear. When a landscape vanishes, people seldom preserve the full map of what was. They retain what endures in story, a place once rich, a place once powerful, a place taken by the sea, a place whose name survives only in doubt. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Atlantis lies not in whether such an empire existed, but in the possibility that the story is compressed memory, distorted, symbolized through generations of retelling, centuries of thought. It may be a philosophical allegory of order and decay. It may be the remnant of a real event, a distant memory of coastal lands erased when climate shifted and waters rose. It may be imagination clinging to a simple, vast possibility, that beyond present shorelines, beneath submerged shelves, there were once communities no longer remembered by history on land. None of these possibilities is strong enough to close the question. None is weak enough to dismiss. Perhaps it is this suspension that keeps Atlantis alive, as literature, as memory, as a darkness with shape but no clear edge. And so what remains is neither a firm claim that Atlantis existed as a complete historical civilization, nor a cold denial that the story stands entirely outside reality. What remains is a broader field of meaning, where Atlantis may be seen as a structure of memory, one that could cling to real fractures at the end of the Ice Age, to a planet once more unstable than we imagine, to shorelines drawn elsewhere, to communities that may have lost not only their land but even their trace of remembrance. The ocean, in that sense, does not only swallow landscapes, it swallows certainty. From there, another question emerges on the far horizon, colder, more distant, toward the north, where water may not be the only force that erases a world from memory. For sometimes what removes an old sky is not the wave, but the ice. Why would a culture born beneath the Mediterranean sun, raised among blue seas, white stone, and mountains long accustomed to warm winds, preserve for so long the image of a north that was not bitterly cold, not dark, not harsh as we imagine it today, but instead bright, gentle, tranquil, distant, and almost untouched by the burdens of ordinary human life? The question seems small at first, no more than a slight deviation in geographic imagination, yet the longer one lingers on it, the wider it opens, like a strange glimmer across a sheet of ice. For that remembered north does not appear as emptiness, not as the forgotten edge of a map, but as a place that once had rhythm, once had air, once had its own seasons, once had days that stretched so long that light itself seemed to become a state of being. In that ancient memory, Hyperborea lies beyond Boreas, beyond the north wind. And Boreas here is not merely a god, not merely the name of a cold current, but a symbolic boundary between the world that can still be named and a stretch of land at the edge of awareness, where things have not entirely left the earth, yet no longer fully belong to the familiar world. That idea alone is enough to give rise to a quiet but profound paradox. For when we speak of the North today, we think of thick ice, long winters, scarce light, winds that cut the skin like a thin blade, a cold silence stretching for thousands of miles. Yet in Greek memory, beyond that northern wind, there lived a people who endured for a very long time, in peace for a very long time, as though time itself did not flow there in the same rhythm as the rest of the world. Hyperborea does not haunt the imagination merely because it is distant. Many lands in myth are distant, many imagined realms are obscure. What sets Hyperborea apart is that it is distant in a way too beautiful, too luminous, too full of life to be nothing more than an abstract blank. The more it is told, the clearer it becomes. The clearer it becomes, the harder it is to confine it within a simple symbolic image of happiness. It is as though that memory is trying to preserve not only a name, but the climate of a place, the breath of a place, the sensation of a land that could once be lived in. That image grows stranger still, for Hyperborea is not veiled in sacred emptiness, but in the details of life. There is not only a vague serenity, but extended light, beautiful forests, rivers, swans, festivals, rituals, music, days that seem always to lean towards spring rather than winter. It is no longer a cold idea, but a world warmed by memory, a world with sound, a world with cycles, a world with a gentle repetition of rites devoted to light. It is here that Apollo enters Hyperborea as a bridge between geography and divinity. When a land is bound to the god of light, music, poetry, healing, and harmonious order, it takes on an entirely different tone. It is no longer a place to be viewed from afar. It becomes a place that can be heard, that can be felt. One can imagine voices rising in the thin, radiant air, lyres trembling through days that never seem to close, processions moving undisturbed by war, by sickness, by the slow decay of time. A land like this, if only fiction, is a fiction built from too many details of life. A land like this, if only a symbol, is a symbol that has absorbed too much of the substance of a real place. Ancient poetic traditions make this even clearer. Hyperborea is not merely a land of happiness in a general sense, but a region of brightness, abundance, duration, ritual beauty, of lifespans beyond the ordinary rhythm, of a serenity that the human world rarely touches except in dreams. From this, a feeling begins to form, slowly yet unmistakably. Hyperborea does not resemble a heaven detached from the earth. It resembles a memory of a place at the edge of the world, where conditions differed enough to approach myth, yet had not entirely left history behind. This becomes clearer still in the way Hyperborea appears in ancient accounts. It is not described as a purely metaphysical realm like Olympus above or Tartarus below. It appears instead as a place very far, very difficult to reach, yet still within the same universe where winds blow, mountains stand, rivers flow, gods pass through, humans offer gifts, and journeys can carry a thread of connection from that distant land to familiar centres of ritual. The Hyperborean maidens, who appear in traditions tied to sacred islands and the worship of radiant gods, bind that land to the Greek world, no longer leaving it isolated like a dream without an owner, a place that can send offerings, a place that enters ritual, a place that leaves behind names. That alone is enough to place Hyperborea in a position both poetic and geographical, both thin as mist and heavy as memory. Even ancient skepticism did not erase Hyperborea, it deepened it. For when a story is repeated, questioned, recorded, and held in a space between belief and doubt, it often gains a peculiar endurance. It no longer flares and fades, but settles into collective memory like a thin yet persistent layer of sediment, so faint as to be nearly transparent, yet too enduring to be brushed away. Atlantis shocks because it sinks. Hyperborea unsettles in another way. It does not sink, does not explode, is not swallowed by the sea. It simply recedes. It recedes into light, into distance, into ice, into memory. From there, a question emerges almost on its own, gentle, yet enough to shift the entire direction of thought. What if Hyperborea is neither a precise map nor direct evidence of a northern civilization, but a mythologized memory of a land that was once different, not a hidden continent fixed by coordinates, but a distant echo of a north that was once more habitable, brighter, less severe, before climate changed enough to render it nearly unlivable? The hypothesis need not go far. It requires only placing two simple things side by side. On one hand, the ancient memory of a peaceful north, of long days, of light, festivals, longevity, and harmony. On the other, the modern understanding that Earth's climate has never been fixed, that regions once hospitable can become harsh, that ice and cold are not eternal backdrops. When these two layers meet, Hyperborea begins to shift. It is no longer merely a distant poetic paradise. It becomes a possibility of memory, not certain, not provable, yet not easily dismissed as a random word. If a land once livable gradually sinks into cold, what form would its memory take? Perhaps no borders remain, no precise names of rivers or mountains, no dates, only an image repeated across generations, a land beyond the north wind, a realm of long light, a place of peace beyond age, beyond sickness, beyond war, a dim homeland of Apollo, a name light as myth, yet heavy as sediment. Then Hyperborea appears as another form of lost civilization, not lost beneath water, but beneath ice, not drowned by rising seas, but locked away by extreme climate and growing distance. A quieter loss, less dramatic, yet perhaps deeper. For what is erased is not only physical traces, but the very possibility of imagining that such a place could once have existed. Lost history is not always beneath the ocean. Sometimes it lies in regions so cold that no one remembers they were once called home. And then another question forms, slowly, like a thin fracture across ice. If Hyperborea is truly a mythologized memory, what happens when that memory is placed beside ancient maps, unconventional readings of the Earth, and a climatic period strong enough to transform a living world into one that can no longer be inhabited? Hyperborea stands at a strange boundary of memory, for in the layer of Greek narration, it is not a land of blizzards, of endless darkness and white ice as the modern imagination paints the north, but a luminous, tranquil realm, almost removed from the harsh rhythm of daily life, a place of light, ease, and distant sanctity, as though the far north was not merely a direction, but a memory of another world. Then the question begins to unfold, slowly yet persistently. If that memory is not entirely symbolic, if behind its sacred image there lies some fragment of geography or climate, what became of a north once imagined as habitable? Did it sink, like continents swallowed by the sea in other legends, or did it remain in place, sealed layer by layer in cold, until ice and distance erased it from the sight of history? From here, the story shifts gently away from pure myth into another space, where the Arctic, Siberia, Northern Europe, and North America of the Ice Age appear beside the maps of early modern and Renaissance Europe, not as final proof, but as objects of reflection, old surfaces where the North was sometimes imagined by a logic different from today, as though collective memory once looked toward it without the same fear of cold that defines the modern world. It is at this intersection between myth, maps, and climate that a name from the 20th century begins to rise as the largest shadow in the attempt to explain a world that may have changed too quickly. Charles Hapgood enters this picture as a figure difficult to ignore, not because he provided a final answer, but because he attempted something rare, to construct a model bold enough to reconsider the speed of planetary change. In the intellectual landscape of mid-20th century America and Europe, particularly through the years 1958, 1966 and 1970, he associated his name with the hypothesis that the Earth's outer crust could shift rapidly, bringing geographical and climatic consequences strong enough to turn once habitable regions into extreme cold, or to push them beyond familiar human conditions. The appeal of Hapgood lies there. He offers the imagination a powerful framework, a mechanics of catastrophe, a way of thinking in which lost continents, lost worlds, or distant paradises do not vanish only through rising seas, but through violent rearrangements of the planet's surface. Yet here caution must remain firm. That Albert Einstein wrote a foreword to his 1958 book does not mean the hypothesis became scientific consensus, nor that modern science accepts crustal displacement as an accurate account of geological history. Later accounts even suggest that Hapgood himself acknowledged Einstein had pointed out flaws in part of the theory. To treat Hapgood as confirmation would weaken the foundation. To see him as a shadow of thought, an attempt haunted by the idea of a planet that can change its skin too quickly, is where his value remains. For that shadow leads back to a firmer ground, where the climate at the end of the Ice Age alone was enough to disrupt what once seemed stable. That ground is the younger Dryas, lasting roughly from about 12,900 to 11,600 years ago, or in rounded terms to about 11,700 years ago, a return to cold just as the late Pleistocene world seemed to be warming. What makes the younger Dryas unsettling is not simply that it was cold, but that it reminds us the end of the Ice Age was not a straight path from ice to melt, from hardship to ease, from white to green. Climate history does not move so gently. It breaks, it reverses, it shifts in rhythms capable of collapsing newly formed balances. Europe, North America, the Arctic, Siberia, and the entire subpolar belt of the Northern Hemisphere thus appear not merely as geography, but as a physical memory where living conditions can be rewritten within a span short enough to become catastrophe for any population bound to it. One needs only imagine a northern fringe in a relatively milder phase, an ecological corridor allowing large animals to pass, allowing humans to move, to dwell, to hunt, to form fragile ways of life, and then a long cold descends like dark water. Ice thickens, winds harden, ecosystems change, paths break, old routes vanish, and what remains is buried in frozen soil, in permafrost, in distances nearly unreachable. In such a moment, a world once livable does not need to shift its poles to become something entirely different. It needs only a change in climate. Only that. The image of woolly mammoths preserved so well in the Siberian permafrost carries a particular weight. They do not prove Hyperborea. They do not declare a northern civilization buried beneath ice. But they show that ice can preserve material memory in a way the ocean cannot, holding the shape of a former life, as though cold does not only destroy but seals, does not only erase but keeps, silently and longer than any human archive. At that point, what once seemed only Greek poetry begins to change its tone. The question is no longer simply where Hyperborea lies on a map, but whether it is a distant memory of a land whose climate shifted until it became unrecognizable even to itself. From there, Hyperborea takes on another form, no longer a claim of archaeology nor a fixed coordinate on the globe, but a figure of geography and memory standing between three overlapping layers. In the oldest layer, it is the bright land of Apollo, where the north is remembered not with fear, but with a serenity beyond the ordinary. In the scientific layer, the younger Dryas reveals that the end of the Ice Age carried disruptions powerful enough to reshape living conditions across much of the Northern Hemisphere. In the reflective layer, a space opens, not wide enough for superstition, yet not narrow enough to dismiss every question. Could some regions once habitable have become uninhabitable, not because they were swallowed by the sea, but because they were sealed by cold, leaving behind only the memory of a lost paradise? Could lost civilizations lie not only beneath water, but beneath ice, beneath cold winds, beneath permafrost, beneath thousands of years of silence in subpolar lands? To say this does not turn Hyperborea into proof, nor does it elevate crustal displacement into truth. It simply places a shadow where it belongs, faint enough to remain myth, yet heavy enough not to be entirely dismissed. Hyperborea thus closes as a structure of thought of measured weight, where Greek memory evokes a very different north, where climatology shows that the end of the Ice Age could fracture the world with deep cold, where lost history may lie not only beneath the ocean, but also asleep beneath ice. From that northern realm blurred by cold winds, the gaze begins to drift southward, toward a wider, darker Pacific, where memory seems to be kept in another way, through islands, through stone, through oral tradition, through the idea of a maritime motherland that once existed and then dissolved like salt mist upon the sea. There are myths that begin as faint echoes, growing louder with time, layered by imagination, by a longing for a past never fully seen. Mu is different. From the moment it entered the modern world, it carried the shape of a complete grand narrative, vast enough to embrace an ocean, distant enough to pull with it the idea of humanity's first cradle. At the centre of this story stands James Churchward, born in 1852 and gone in 1936, a figure who does not appear as a geologist bound to numbers, nor as an archaeologist rising from soil and artifact, but rather as a builder of an immense stage where geography, symbol, religion, ancient memory, and scattered civilizations are drawn together, then merged into a single tale. From the late 19th into the early 20th century, within an English-speaking intellectual atmosphere where sunken continents and lost homelands of civilization held a particular fascination, he began to shape his doctrine. When his books on Mu appeared throughout the 1920s, especially one published in 1926 and reissued in the early 1930s, Mu was no longer a vague suggestion of a lost land. It became a world. It became an almost all-encompassing explanation. It became a vast shadow cast across the whole of ancient history. What is striking is not that the story rests upon a powerful scientific foundation, but that it is told with such smoothness, such continuity, such enchantment. Lemuria once passed through a phase as a hypothesis tied to biology and geography, before being carried far into the realm of mysticism. Mu, in Churchward's telling, seems to emerge directly from the crossroads between the desire to explain everything and the allure of modern myth. He claimed to have touched ancient clay tablets, and from them traced the existence of a lost continent in the Pacific, a primordial homeland from which nearly all great human traditions once began. It is here that Mu reveals its true power. It does not persuade first through evidence. It persuades through the structure of its storytelling. The story unfolds in a manner familiar to many modern myths, beginning with an ancient text said to be readable by only a very few. In Churchward's own account, the decisive encounter took place when he was still young in India, more than half a century before he published his famous works. He wrote that a Hindu priest showed him ancient tablets, then taught him how to approach a lost language, allowing him to read the secrets of a vanished age. From that moment, the story ceases to be an ordinary speculation. It is wrapped in the light of revelation. It carries the sense of a hidden door newly opened, revealing knowledge not meant for the many, not belonging to formal institutions, but flowing quietly through a narrow and ancient lineage. That is precisely what makes Mu so compelling from its very first pages. A bare hypothesis exposes its skeleton. A revealed secret is different. It has flesh, breath, ritual, and the depth of shadow. Churchward claimed that from those tablets he learned where humanity first appeared, the history of Mu, its symbols, its population, its prosperity, and its destruction. In other words, the entire foundation of this doctrine rests upon his account of something only he could read. That detail is both the lifeblood of Mu and its most fundamental weakness. For when the foundation of evidence lies almost entirely in the testimony of one man, the greater the aura of mystery, the greater the need for caution. Could such a hidden tradition truly have existed? Or is it all a structure built upon belief in unverifiable texts? The question does not disappear. It lingers beside the story, like a thin shadow that never leaves the light. Once that door is opened, Mu expands at once into something greater than a continent. It becomes the source of all sources. In its most common descriptions, Churchward places the fall of Mu around 10,000 years before the present, sometimes closer to 12,000, as though the continent stood at the final edge of a pre-Diluvian world, deep in the past yet close enough for fragments of memory to scatter through the myths of many peoples. Its imagined geography is equally overwhelming, stretching across much of the Pacific, from distant archipelagos scattered across open waters to the southern seas, unfolding like a map too beautiful not to captivate. But what sets Mu apart from other lost continents is not merely its scale, it is its ambition. Mu is not simply told as a place that once existed, it is told as the first cradle of nearly all human civilization. Within that grand narrative, Mu possesses writing, mathematics, astronomy, advanced social organization, and knowledge older than any known civilization. From it, the great streams of both the old world and the new are drawn back to a single root. Egypt is no longer only Egypt. India is no longer only India. Babylon, Mesoamerica, the island traditions of the Pacific, all become distant branches of a common trunk severed by the sea. This is the moment Mu transcends the scale of a local lost land and becomes the motherland of human memory, a mother world, a place from which the sun, symbols, stone structures, religion, technology, and early migrations radiate outward like ripples across water. The allure of Mu lies precisely there. It gathers fragments that do not belong to the same system and places them along a single axis, making the chaos of history seem to conceal a deeper order. Isolated islands in the ocean, recurring solar symbols across cultures, solitary stone structures standing within collective memory, the persistent obsession with lost ancestors, all are drawn into the same breath. Too many things are connected, too many gaps are filled, too many questions are answered with a single name. Perhaps this is why Mu remains so powerful in modern imagination, not because it has been confirmed, but because it is too complete not to enchant. Yet a world that perfect in imagination rarely escapes the final pattern of lost continent myths. Mu, like many vanished civilizations, is allowed to flourish long enough for its splendor to seize the mind, only to be destroyed swiftly enough that its order dissolves into legend. In Churchward's narrative, the continent is swallowed by earthquakes, volcanoes, fire from the depths, rising seas, a destruction that comes almost overnight, as though nature abruptly closes the door on an age. A vast, ancient, highly advanced civilization sinks beneath the waters, leaving only scattered symbols, faint remnants, echoes without form. The pattern is strangely familiar: zenith, then catastrophe, radiance, then darkness, emergence, then disappearance, cycle after cycle, myth after myth, memory after memory. It is here that the boundary must be kept clear. The strength of Mu does not lie in its agreement with modern geology. A continent of such scale vanishing in so short a time is not supported by the framework of plate tectonics. What science understands about Earth's crust, about the movement of plates, about the rhythm of continental formation and disappearance, leaves little room for a literal Mu. Yet Mu does not vanish from cultural meaning because of this. Some stories do not exist as maps of reality, but as maps of obsession. Mu is one of them. It reveals how deeply modern humanity has longed for a primordial motherland, a great origin, a place where all fragments of ancient memory might be gathered into a single body. Thus, the true place of Mu in this journey is not as a conclusion to be believed literally, but as a myth too vast to ignore and too fragile in evidence to be accepted as history. It is immensely compelling in imagination. It is remarkably fragile in proof. It endures because it touches something deep within the collective memory of ocean-facing cultures, where the horizon always suggests that beyond it lies another world, a lost world, one that survives only in songs, in symbols, in old stones, and in stories that refuse to fully sink. Perhaps because Mu is too vast, too beautiful, too complete to be believed whole. What must follow is not an attempt to preserve that imagined continent, but a search for what is smaller, more tangible, heavier in the hand and clearer in the light. Real islands, real stone structures, real maritime memories across the immense Pacific, and the question of whether what was lost was not a supercontinent, but an oceanic world that once connected distant shores through horizons, through stars, through the memory of those who lived upon the water and believed that the sea does not only divide, but also remembers. Perhaps the most important point here is not whether one must believe the entire story of Mu, but to retain its most valuable core and place that core within a steadier, calmer frame, one closer to a world that can still be touched. For when an image grows too vast, a supercontinent swallowed whole by the sea, it ignites the imagination, yet easily slips away from the ground of evidence. The question worth keeping is not necessarily whether Mu existed as a massive landmass, but whether the distant islands of the Pacific, from Rapa Nui at the far eastern edge of Polynesia, to Pohnpei in Micronesia, to Tongatapu of Tonga in the southwest, once belonged to a maritime cultural network far deeper than we usually imagine. Within that frame, the central figure is no longer a sunken continent, but ancient island communities, seafaring peoples who knew how to navigate, how to raise stone, how to organize ritual, how to preserve ancestral memory across generations. As though the sea did not merely divide them, but once bound them together, Mur, in this sense, begins to change form. No longer a continent too perfect to believe, it becomes a quieter yet more serious question about a fragmented oceanic world. To let that question stand, one must go to places where memory has become stone. Rapa Nui is one such place, isolated in the eastern Pacific, so remote that the emptiness surrounding it becomes part of its mystery. It does not appear as the remnant of a sunken continent, but as the farthest extension of a tradition mature enough to shape a monumental ritual landscape. Polynesian communities arrived here near the end of the first millennium and over the centuries that followed, especially between the 11th and 17th centuries. They raised stone platforms, long and heavy ahu, along with nearly 900 Moai statues facing the vastness like markers of memory. Yet there is more than statues. There are hundreds of ceremonial platforms, countless structures tied to habitation, agriculture, burial, and production, as though the entire island were a text written in stone, where ancestors, livelihood, and social order are inscribed upon the land. What impresses here is not merely scale, but the organizational capacity behind it. The ability to sustain a collective memory strong enough to turn ancestral faces into colossal forms in one of the most isolated places on the ocean. A distant island, yet not empty. A thin edge of the map, yet dense with symbols, making the question of a broader maritime network feel heavier, more tangible, harder to dismiss. If Rapa Nui is the edge of statues and ancestors, then farther west, off the southeastern coast of Pohnpei, lies a place where that mystery takes on the form of a real city. Nan Madol is not a fireside myth. It has a location, it has stone walls, it has canals. It bears the history of a ceremonial centre that flourished between roughly 1200 and 1500 associated with the Sodler dynasty. Upon a coral reef, more than 100 artificial islets were constructed with basalt and coral, containing traces of palaces, temples, tombs, and dwellings, as though someone chose not only to live upon the sea, but to impose the order of stone upon water. This image matters because it does what Mu in its original form could not. It brings the mystery down to the surface, or rather, onto the water. No longer a continent spanning an ocean, but a real architectural centre where construction, spatial organisation, and ritual power converge into a complex that challenges the simplistic view of Pacific islands. An island world, it turns out, is not merely scattered points on a map. It can hold intricate systems, centres of power, spatial logics far greater than modern impressions suggest. Nan Madol is where Mu ceases to be the dream of a storyteller and becomes an architectural question. A question built of basalt, coral, and tide. Tonga adds another voice to this picture. Less monumental than Nan Madol, less dense than Rapa Nui, yet strong enough to deepen the ocean's memory. On Tonga Tapu stands Ha'amonga a Maui, a massive stone gateway often dated to the 13th century, tied to the Tongan royal tradition and to the shadow of Maui within Polynesian myth. It is not a city upon water. It is not a field of colossal statues. Yet its stillness carries its own weight, like a stone punctuation mark within an ocean so vast that any megalith becomes unforgettable. Some places do not require abundance to express depth. 3 stones are enough. A gateway standing across centuries is enough. A symbol enduring long enough to remind us that Polynesia is not a random scattering of islands, but a space of ritual, symbol, sovereignty, and constructed memory. Haemonga, a Maui proves no supercontinent. It does something quieter. It shows that in another corner of this ocean, humans also raise stone into symbol, leaving a presence too clear to be dismissed as emptiness between islands. When Rapa Nui, Nan Madol, and Tonga emerge as 3 stones across distant regions of the Pacific, what remains is not to force them into a rigid conclusion, but to connect them through something softer, dimmer, yet far more enduring, the myth of a lost homeland. Across Polynesia, Micronesia, and many other island communities, oral memory holds a special place, not merely as story, but as a way of maintaining relationships with ancestors, coastlines, environmental change, with times when the sea advanced upon the land and when land retreated before water. Within that layer of memory, the motif of a mother island, an ancestral land, a lost homeland, a place once inhabited, once ordered, once alive, then taken by the sea or broken by distance, returns again and again like waves. Here Mu transforms more clearly. No longer a perfectly intact continent too complete to be believed literally, it becomes the possibility of a maritime world, where island communities were once deeply connected through voyages, rituals, stone building, kinship, and ancestral memory, only to have that continuity fractured by the sea, environmental change, and geography itself. There need not be a sunken continent. It is enough that there was once a more vibrant oceanic network, later scattered into islands of memory. It is enough that there was a world not entirely erased by water, but altered enough that connection became myth. Perhaps what was lost was not land. Perhaps what was lost was continuity. Not a continent, but a network. Not a massive seabed, but an oceanic world that once knew how to bind itself together and slowly forgot the paths that made it whole. In that space, the mystery remains intact, yet less extreme, less opposed to science, and perhaps more sorrowful. For what is lost is no longer a mythical continent, but a real human world of real islands, real memory, worn down by water and time until only stone, story. And vast silences between distant shores remain, and if the Pacific has preserved its memory in such a way, through stone figures, stone cities, stone gates, ancestors, and water, then a larger question begins to rise almost naturally. Why do stories of a world erased by water appear not in one ocean alone, but across so many cultures on this planet? When the map of ancient memory stretches far enough, something strange begins to emerge, not in a single valley, not within a single faith, not along a single riverbank, but across a space so vast it nearly encircles the whole memory of humankind. In ancient Mesopotamia, a survivor passes through the flood in his vessel. In the Hebrew tradition, a family is preserved while the old order is drowned. In India, a warning comes before the rising waters, and then a boat carries the seeds of life into another world. In Greece, a pair remains after the waters sweep away the former race of men. In China, water is not only a catastrophe, but a problem to be guided, tamed, and returned to order. Farther still, in the memories of many communities across the Americas and among the islands of the Pacific, that same image appears again under different names, with different gods in different lands, yet the rhythm of the telling remains uncannily familiar. The waters come. The old world vanishes. A very few remain. A story is carried across the far shore of time. When the same pattern appears from the Middle East to India, China, Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands, it becomes difficult to regard it as merely a local feature of a single culture. Look more slowly, more deeply, and these stories begin to lose their isolation as separate religious texts. They reveal themselves instead as variations of a single structure of memory. There is always, first, an old world, an old order, an old humanity. Then comes a deviation, a fault, a decline, or simply a boundary crossed. The waters rise, not merely as rain, not merely as flood, but as a force of erasure, sweeping away homes, borders, names, even the feeling of stable ground beneath one's feet. After the waters, a few remain. Utnapishtiya survives the flood in the Mesopotamian epic. Noah stands at the center of the Judeo-Christian memory of the Great Deluge. Manu is warned in advance, builds his vessel, and becomes the point from which the human order begins again. Deucalion and Pyrrha pass through the waters of ancient Greece. Dayu introduces a striking variation, where water is not only destructive but compels humankind to rebuild the world through the art of controlling it. In the Aztec memory of world ages, a previous world also ends in water, with only a few lives remaining after the catastrophe. Placed side by side, these stories are no longer fragments. They become a repeating rhythm, an old world, a boundary broken. The waters rise, a few survive, a new order begins. What makes this pattern haunting lies not in the waters themselves, but in the faces that remain after them. For in most great traditions, the survivors are not merely the fortunate who escape death. They carry something far heavier across to the other shore. Utnapishtim bears not only life through the disaster, but the memory of a world erased by the gods. Noah saves not only his family and the animals, but steps into a new covenant after the flood, as though human history were rewritten upon still wet earth. Manu is not only one who escapes the waters, but the beginning of the world's order once more. Deucalion and Pyrrha do not merely live, but take on the role of restoring humankind. Dayu shows a remarkable transformation, where what survives the flood is not only the body, but the capacity to reorganize the world, to turn chaos into channels that can be guided, divided, led back to the sea. Thus, in the memory of the deluge, what survives is not only flesh. What survives is memory, law, covenant, the pattern by which the new world understands where it has come from. A civilization may lose its land, its cities, its shores, but as long as there remains one who can tell of the waters, the old order has not entirely died. Once that layer of memory becomes clear, a more physical question begins to unfold, slowly, like the tide advancing upon the shore. What in the real world could have nourished these repeating patterns of story? At the end of the Ice Age, moving into the early Holocene, roughly between 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, the Earth did not possess the same shorelines we know today. Ice melted, seas rose, glacial lakes burst, river mouths shifted, low plains vanished. Continental shelves sank beneath the water. Since the last glacial maximum, global sea levels have risen by roughly 120 meters, a figure large enough to reshape coastlines on an almost planetary scale. This means that the places humans most often chose to inhabit, river mouths, deltas, coastal plains, regions of easy travel, fishing, and cultivation, were also the most vulnerable to erasure as waters rose slowly over centuries, sometimes more rapidly during the early phases of deglaciation. Regions such as the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf, or the margins of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean thus evoke not only geography, but the possibility of collective losses too vast to vanish entirely from memory. What was lost was not only land. What was lost were old paths, old dwellings, old ritual grounds, the sense of an old homeland, the old map of the world itself. There is no need to assume that every flood myth arose from a single event to see that post-glacial changes provided a powerful physical foundation for memories of water and loss. When layers of myth settle upon layers of geology, what remains is not a neat answer, but a question vast enough to touch nearly the entire spiritual history of humankind. Why do so many distant cultures remember a world swept away by water? Why does this memory return with such similar structure from Mesopotamia, the Levant, India, Greece, China, Mesoamerica, to the islands of the Pacific? It may be that water was always the greatest force in the lives of ancient societies. It may be that repeated floods in many regions were magnified into myth. It may be that after the Ice Age, too many communities truly witnessed geographic losses beyond the memory of a single lifetime and carried that loss across generations through story. Or perhaps, more deeply still, water became the perfect symbol for everything civilization fears most. Boundaries erased, maps altered, the old world withdrawn from sight. The essential question is no longer to force all these traditions into a single great deluge. The deeper question is why the memory of water, of loss, of a world before, persists so stubbornly in the shared mind of humanity. When so many cultures remember water as a force of erasure, the question is not only what they told, but what they may have lost. What wounds most deeply may not be the story of a great flood, but the way water arrives so slowly that it is almost invisible within a single lifetime, yet powerful enough to reshape an entire world when seen across thousands of years, from roughly 14,000 to 8,000 years ago. As the Earth emerged from the final cold of the Ice Age and entered the early Holocene, continental ice melted, global sea levels rose, and shorelines across the planet began to retreat inland. Not like a wall of water crashing down in an afternoon, but like a cold and patient hand pressing a little farther onto the old land with each passing generation. Some places that were once fertile coastal plains became marshland, some river mouths became shallow bays, some paths along sandy shores became stretches of darkening water, deeper with each year, wider with each life. In those shallow, resource-rich waters, at river mouths, upon low continental shelves now submerged, people must have witnessed these changes not as geological charts, but as a slow shifting of daily life. A familiar landing place moved farther away. An old fishing ground no longer lay where it once had. A shoreline remembered by grandparents had slipped beyond the sight of their grandchildren. The Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf, the ancient shelves of the Mediterranean, along with many similar regions across the globe, may once have been landscapes far richer in habitation than modern maps allow us to imagine. There may have been low shores, mud flats, currents of fish, branching river mouths like veins, patches of land just high enough to build upon, just close enough to water to live by tides, shellfish, fish, birds, salt, reeds, and seaways. And then the sea advanced, quietly, without pause. Seen this way, geology ceases to be an abstraction. It becomes lived experience. It becomes what a community must endure with its own feet as it withdraws from waters that once sustained it. There are no named heroes in this story, only unnamed communities living by the water, those who rode along the coast, those who read the stars to find their river mouths, those who counted fishing seasons by moonlight and wind, those who built their sacred places at the edge of the sea where sky, water, and land seemed to meet most clearly. They did not step out of myth. They stepped back from a changing shoreline, little by little, yet without reversal. What was once shore became bay. What was once river mouth became seabed. What once opened onto a familiar horizon became an unfamiliar expanse of water. What was left behind was not only land, it was an entire way of life rooted in that land as roots cling to wet soil. Imagine slowly a waterside village withdrawn from the living map. First, the landing place abandoned as channels shift, then low houses forsaken as salt water intrudes, then burial grounds eroded by waves, then sacred places once facing a sandy shore, now looking out upon grey water. Every rhythm of life by the water can be severed from the ground that gave it form. Familiar routes between shoals and higher ground disappear. Temporary moorings become waters too deep. A plain once stretched between branching rivers becomes an unpredictable brackish expanse. One of the most compelling visions of such loss lies in ancient gulf basins later filled by the sea. Lowlands that may once have been fertile plains capable of sustaining prehistoric communities before rising waters forced them gradually upward. This idea need not become a grand tale of a lost empire, held at its proper stillness. It is already painful enough. A community need not vanish in a single day, yet its way of life may be dismantled piece by piece as its living space is erased. In other ancient coastal regions, submerged traces suggest this is not mere speculation. There are cultural landscapes truly taken by the sea, artifacts resting upon drowned continental shelves, fragments of a longer story the present land no longer fully holds. Yet land and place are not the deepest layer of loss. There are things unseen upon maps, yet so bound to the landscape that when the landscape vanishes, they vanish with it. A waterside world creates not only houses and boats, but calendars of life, pathways, ways of remembering that make sense only within that space. When the sea rises, what is lost is not only a plane of earth. What is lost may also be the calendar tied to tides and fish migrations, the knowledge of channels visible only at certain waters, these small landing places never marked on any chart but memory, the art of navigating by stars along a specific coast with its headlands and sandbars and river mouths, the experience of cultivating half-salt, half-fresh soils, the rituals bound to places where ancestors once lived, were buried, and departed. Perhaps the deepest pain is not the loss of a village, but the loss of an entire system of knowledge that once fit perfectly with a world that no longer exists. A different world demands a different memory. A different world requires a different calendar, a different reading of the stars, a different rhythm of movement. When old shores sink, such knowledge does not always travel intact with those who move inland. Some of it is carried like seed, some fades with each generation, some survives as ritual whose origins are no longer fully understood, some breaks into myth because the landscape that sustained it has vanished, leaving only a faint memory that there was once a path, a landing place, a way of reading the stars, a homeland now lying beneath the sea. Seen in this way, modern archaeology reveals a quiet but immense limitation. What is uncovered on land is often only what remains above, what can still be touched, what falls within familiar ranges of survey. Yet if much of early human life was tied to coasts, river mouths, low plains and shallow shelves, then the archaeological record on land may be only what has survived. The other part, the ancient shores, harbours, sea routes, and resource-rich coastal zones, may lie beneath the water, too deep, too vast, or too fragmented to be easily told as a continuous story. The Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf, the drowned coasts of Indonesia, and many other continental shelves suggest a possibility increasingly difficult to ignore, that these now submerged spaces once held far greater significance for human prehistory than modern maps quietly lead us to believe. From this emerges a quiet but immense thought. What has been lost may not be a single city, it may be an entire layer of history. The first half of human history may lie beneath the water, beyond the reach of our usual storytelling, while what we uncover on land is only the portion that remained above, spared by elevation, distance from advancing seas, and the endurance of time. If this is true, even in part, then the human past is broader than what the land still allows us to see. The picture we assemble may be real, yet only half of it remains dry. That thought turns the eye back to the land with a different weight. If the sea has taken most of the coastal past, if low plains, river mouths, shoals, and continental shelves have been erased from the everyday reach of archaeology, then what still stands upon the earth today, especially those vast stone forms rising through rain and millennia, may carry a greater burden than we have assumed. They may not be merely structures, they may be the last remnants still visible above a far older memory, a memory the waters nearly erased, but not entirely. After all the blurred maps, the misnamed continents, the stories of rising waters, the coastlines that have receded into forgetting, what remains upon the earth is stone. Stone here is not merely matter, but a kind of silence hardened through time, a presence that says little, yet compels the eye to pause. At Giza, on the west bank of the Nile, vast blocks still rise into a geometry so exact it seems as though time has only brushed their surface. North of Cusco, upon the highlands of Peru, the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman still lie in place, their joints bending in strange angles, as if the hands that set them there held not only strength, but an almost absolute sense of form. From these two places, the field of vision extends farther still, toward megalithic traditions spread across continents, across ages, across cultures, yet leaving behind a shared impression that ancient people knew how to bring immense stones into an order that carried meaning. What is striking is that this sense of wonder does not arise from scale alone. A stone weighing tens of tons is enough to slow the mind. A mass so large it seems to exceed the familiar limits of the human body is enough to provoke the first questions. Yet the gaze lowers from mass to surface, from surface to joint, from joint to angle, from angle to placement, proportion, order. There. Sheer size is no longer enough. There. Stone begins to speak of design, of organization, of measurement, of patience stretched across many seasons of sun and rain, across generations of labor. It is no longer simply human strength confronting weight. It is technical memory, collective discipline, the ability to shape chaos into form. If one must choose a first symbol of that union between scale and precision, Giza almost always comes to mind. On the Giza Plateau during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, around 2575 to 2465 BCE, the pyramids were raised as a declaration in stone of proportion, of order, of material endurance that few structures in the world can rival. The Great Pyramid, associated with Khufu, is not merely large in the ordinary sense. It is composed of some 2.3 million blocks of stone, with a total mass of about 5.75 million tons, a figure large enough to blur the boundary between construction and landscape. Yet what makes that place more haunting than its scale is its precision. The entire structure is aligned almost exactly with the 4 cardinal directions, with a rigor that resists any notion of mere labor. Behind it must lie measurement, behind it must lie calculation, behind it must lie a system capable of organizing materials, labor, time, and space deeply enough to turn an idea into a form that stands for millennia. Khufu is one name that remains. Behind that name stand countless others who are no longer remembered, those who measured the ground, those who moved the stone, those who understood direction, who read the axis of the sky, who knew how a mass of immense weight could be set precisely into its place within a greater whole. Giza does not need to be wrapped in mystery to become astonishing. In truth, when placed within the framework of known history, it becomes even more so. For what emerges then is not miracle, but the concentrated capacity of human beings. An ancient civilization was able to organize labor, manage materials, control proportion, and position space with enough precision to leave behind a material trace that cannot be ignored. Yet Giza is not the only question. Across the ocean, in another world, another language of stone awaits. Sacsayhuaman does not enter memory through a vast triangular plain. It enters through its megalithic walls, built from polygonal stones, irregular, non-uniform, yet fitted together with a tightness that scarcely allows a blade to pass. High above the north of Cusco, within the ritual and political space of the Inca world, this technique appears as a different kind of refinement, unlike Giza, yet no less profound. If Giza astonishes through proportion and alignment, Sacsayhuaman astonishes through the control of form within apparent disorder. Each stone seems to hold its own shape, yet placed together, they lock into one another as if conceived within a single material logic. That impression deepens when placed alongside the stonework tradition of Cusco, where a 12-angled stone has become a symbol of the level of precision Inca builders could achieve. Though not set within the walls of Sacsayhuaman itself, it makes one thing clear: this was not accident, not an isolated exception, but the result of a highly developed tradition of working stone. From Giza to Sacsayhuaman, what emerges is not a single hidden empire that built every monument upon the earth. That reading is too easy, too hurried, too eager for answers larger than the question itself. What emerges instead is a broader, deeper, more demanding problem. Ancient people truly could do these things. That must be the starting point. Not to deny their capacity and fill the gap with myth. Not to imagine an agent beyond humanity simply because we are unaccustomed to recognizing the depth of ancient knowledge. Yet once that is acknowledged, another layer of questions opens at once. How was that knowledge accumulated? Through whom was it transmitted? How long did it endure before arriving at the material moment we still see today? Behind each structure, is there a longer history of learning, of experiment, of failure, of correction, of apprenticeship, of observing the sky, of organizing labor, a history of which the present record preserves only the surface? The concept of the megalith, in its broadest sense, does not belong to a single place. Large stone structures appear across many regions of the world, from Europe, Africa, and Western Asia to the Americas and distant islands. They need not belong to a single civilization to hold meaning within this story. What repeats is not necessarily a shared power, but perhaps a shared capacity. The capacity to bring immense stone into symbolic, ritual, architectural, astronomical, defensive, or commemorative order. Many archaeologists rightly emphasize that such works can be understood within known historical frameworks, through the labor, social organization, and techniques of ancient people themselves. That view must be retained. Yet other researchers pose an equally important question. Not who built them, but how deep the accumulated knowledge behind that building may have been. That question does not deny history. It suggests only that the history of human knowledge may be more complex than our familiar outlines, longer, more fragmented, marked by greater loss. When all these fragments are set side by side, the myths of cyclical civilizations, the hypothesis that traces of ancient industry may be erased from geology, the half-historical, half-symbolic names such as Lemuria, Atlantis, Hyperborea, Mu, the memories of flood, the vanished coasts, the submerged stone landscapes beyond reach, and the great blocks still standing upon the land like the hardest bones of the past. The final question begins to change. It is no longer whether 6 previous civilizations certainly existed. Many of them may be symbolic, some may be memories altered by time. A few fragments may be histories sunk too deep to be fully touched. But if all previous cycles, whatever their form, ultimately leave behind only a few anomalies, a few stones, a few layers of sediment, a few broken stories, then what will our modern civilization leave behind after 10,000 years? After 100,000? Perhaps what endures will not be glass towers, luminous screens, or the networks of data that now cover human life. Perhaps these will vanish more quickly than we imagine, dissolving into moisture, into salt, into the movement of the earth, into the slow transformations time carries out with quiet persistence. Perhaps what remains will be only a few irregularities in sediment, faint chemical traces, a few structures of stone more stubborn than the rest, a few stories told incorrectly yet preserving some inner core of truth. Perhaps this too has happened many times before, at whatever scale, within myth, within collective memory, within recorded history, or within that uncertain space where all three meet. What remains, then, after this journey is not a fixed answer. What remains is a stance, a slowing before time, a humility before the possibility of loss, a caution toward the belief that the present civilization is the final summit, the most enduring form, the version that will not vanish. The stones of Giza and Sacsayhuaman still stand, quieter than any argument, heavier than any theory, as if they do not compel us to believe in a lost global empire, but only to accept something far simpler, that human beings, long ago, already knew how to build, how to measure, how to organize, how to leave behind things far greater than their own lives. And so the final question draws nearer, so near it almost touches the present. If they are remembered only through fragments such as these, are we truly any different